Hello everyone, this anime Uchiha X. And today we have a what if Issei was the reincarnation of Jubei Kibagami movie. Let's get started. Issei Hayadu, only 10 years old, had never known the comfort of a normal family life. His parents abandoned him when he was just a baby, leaving him to be raised in a foster home. Issei often wondered why they had left him, but there was no answer, only an emptiness that filled his chest. His life had been a series of empty days, wandering from one temporary home to the next, never staying anywhere long enough to form real connections. Yet there was something about him, something deep within, that felt different, like he was meant for something greater. One day, Issei found himself wandering through the dense forest near his current foster home. He didn't have any particular reason for being there. He just needed to escape. The usual emptiness inside him was too overwhelming. The wind rustled the leaves, and everything seemed quiet, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then something caught his eye. Tucked away in the distance, hidden beneath thick vines and ivy, was an old, forgotten temple. The air felt heavy with the weight of time. Without thinking, Issei pushed his way through the underbrush and approached the ruins. Inside, the temple was ancient, crumbling stone and broken pillars strewn about. But in the center of it all was a stone pedestal with an object resting upon it. A katana. The sword seemed to call out to him, like it was waiting for him to find it. Without hesitation, Issei stepped forward, his heart racing. He reached out and gripped the hilt. The moment his hand touched the blade, a surge of memories flooded his mind. Memories of another life, another man. He saw himself, but it wasn't Issei. It was a warrior, a master swordsman. Jubei Kibagami. The memories hit him hard, like a wave crashing over him, but with them came an undeniable truth. Issei wasn't just Issei Hayadu. He was the reincarnation of Jubei Kibagami, the legendary swordsman. Training begins. With his new identity weighing heavily on him, Issei didn't waste any time. The katana felt natural in his hands, as if it had always belonged there. The flood of memories from Jubei's life filled him with a deep sense of purpose. The man he had once been, the skilled, ruthless swordsman, now lived inside of him. No longer just an abandoned child, Issei now had a clear path ahead. The katana was his birthright, and he would master it, just as Jubei had before him. Issei began his training immediately. He isolated himself in the forest, away from the world and all its distractions. Day after day, he swung the katana, practicing the basics, strikes, blocks, and stances. The blade moved with perfect fluidity in his hands, its weight and balance aligning perfectly with his body. It was as if the katana was an extension of himself. He didn't have a master, but the memories of Jubei's techniques came to him effortlessly. He knew how to fight, how to battle. Issei pushed himself hard, often practicing for hours until his arms ached, his body bruised and sore. But it didn't matter. Every swing of the blade, every step in his training brought him closer to something more, closer to the man he had once been. The power of the katana surged within him. With each passing day, Issei grew faster, stronger, more skilled. He was no longer just a boy. He was Jubei Kibagami reborn. The path of the sword. Issei walked silently through the forest, his black kimono swaying in the wind as he made his way to his usual training spot. The fabric had grown accustomed to his movements, fitting him like a second skin. But it was more than just clothing. It was the symbol of his new life, one that had started the moment he found the katana in the abandoned temple. The katana rested behind his back, wrapped in black bandages, hidden from sight. He was a boy with a new purpose, no longer lost and abandoned, but a young warrior on a path unknown, following the legacy of the blade he had inherited. The sword felt alive in his hands, even when it was sheathed. He could sense the weight of it, its power that pulsed with every heartbeat. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a part of him. And every time he trained, he grew closer to understanding that. Issei reached the clearing, the same spot he had been coming to for the past few months. He knelt down and removed the bandages from the katana, revealing the polished steel blade that gleamed under the afternoon sun. It wasn't just beautiful, it was deadly. With the blade now free, Issei stood up, pulling his kimono tighter around his waist. He drew a deep breath, the air filled with the scent of the earth and the faint rustle of leaves. His eyes narrowed in focus, and the world around him disappeared. There was only the blade in his body. It was time to train again. The first few days were rough. His movements were slow and clumsy. He hadn't had any formal training, and even the sword itself felt foreign to him. But Issei was nothing if not determined. He spent hours each day, practicing his stances, his swings, and his footwork. His muscles ached, his hands blistered, but he never stopped. Day after day, he repeated the same exercises, pushing himself to the limit. Sometimes he'd practice alone in the woods, while other times he'd test himself against trees, rocks, and the occasional stray animal that dared to cross his path. Each time, the sword seemed to grow lighter in his hands, his strikes more fluid. After a few weeks, Issei started to notice something different. His speed had increased, and his reflexes had sharpened. He could hear the wind whispering around him, feel the earth beneath his feet. His body had started to understand the rhythm of the sword. He had become one with it. One day, as the sun began to set, he practiced a series of swift strikes, each one faster than the last. His movements blurred with the wind, the katana slicing through the air like it was an extension of his very soul. A smile crept onto his face as he sheathed the blade, satisfied with his progress. His body was tired, his muscles sore, but the sense of accomplishment was worth it. Issei spent days, weeks, training without stopping. His mind would wander sometimes to his past, to the memories he couldn't quite recall, but he always pushed them aside. He didn't need those memories. He had found his purpose. The sword was his only companion, and through it, he would create his own path. One evening, while walking back to his makeshift home in the forest, Issei heard the distant sound of something rustling in the underbrush. His senses were heightened, every fiber of his being on alert. With the swift motion of someone who had been training for months, he reached for his katana, drawing it in one smooth motion. Out of the bushes stumbled a man, tall and scruffy, holding a large sack of supplies. He seemed harmless enough, but Issei didn't take chances anymore. "Who are you?" Issei's voice was calm but edged with a seriousness that made the man hesitate. The stranger raised his hands in surrender. "I'm just passing through, kid. No harm done. I didn't mean to scare you." Issei didn't lower his sword. He had learned to trust no one, not after everything he had been through. "Leave," Issei said, his voice firm, the katana still in his hand. The man gulped, realizing he wasn't dealing with a normal boy. "All right, kid. You win. I'm gone." With one last nervous glance, the man turned and retreated into the forest, leaving Issei alone once again. Issei sheathed the katana and continued on his way. His heart had been racing for a moment, but now it slowed as he returned to his home. The blade that defies fate. The moon hung high over the darkened forest, casting a silver glow upon the treetops. Issei stood in the clearing, his black kimono billowing in the night breeze. His katana, still wrapped in black bandages, rested behind his back. His body, once frail and untrained, had hardened from relentless training. Each movement was sharper, each breath more controlled. He had become a warrior, not just a boy wielding a blade. Yet something felt off. For weeks, he had been training in solitude, far from civilization, away from the world that had abandoned him. But tonight, the wind carried a different scent, one unfamiliar yet unmistakable. He wasn't alone. Issei's fingers twitched as he slowly reached for his katana, his senses heightened. A rustling sound echoed from the treetops, followed by a hushed voice. "He's here." The words were faint, but Issei caught them. His eyes narrowed. Whoever they were watching him, studying him. A low sigh left his lips. "So it finally begins," he muttered under his breath. Without hesitation, Issei unsheathed his katana in one smooth motion. The blade gleamed under the moonlight, its sharp edge whispering tales of bloodshed yet to come. Then a blur of movement. From the trees, 3 figures dropped into the clearing, each clad in deep blue hooded cloaks. Their faces were partially hidden, but their presence was unmistakable. They were warriors, fighters, and from the way they moved, Issei could tell they weren't amateurs. The tallest one stepped forward, his voice calm yet firm. "You're an interesting one, kid." Issei said nothing, his grip on the katana unwavering. The man chuckled. "No fear? Good. That means we won't have to waste time testing you." Issei's eyes sharpened. "Testing me?" The man nodded. "We've been watching you for some time now. A swordsman training alone in a world full of devils, angels, and fallen. You're either a fool or something more." Issei remained silent, processing the man's words. He had avoided the supernatural world for so long, thinking he could carve his own path without getting involved in their battles. But it seemed fate had other plans. Still, he wasn't about to let some strangers dictate his next move. "If you're here to fight, then draw your weapons," Issei said coldly. "If not, leave." The second figure, shorter and more slender, laughed. "He's got fire. I like that." The tallest one smirked. "Not here to fight, kid. We're here to offer you something. A chance to sharpen that blade of yours against real opponents." Issei's eyes narrowed. "And why would I trust you?" The third figure finally spoke, his voice deep and measured. "Because we are warriors like you, and because soon you'll have no choice." The air grew heavy with tension. Issei wasn't sure what they meant, but deep down, he could feel it. Something was coming. Something bigger than his training, bigger than the solitude he had built for himself. For the first time in years, he stood at a crossroads. Would he continue walking this path alone? Or would he take the first step toward a fate he had yet to understand? A swordsman enters the city. The city was nothing like the quiet solitude of the forest. The air buzzed with life, cars honking, people chatting, the faint scent of street food lingering in the air. It was overwhelming, almost suffocating. Issei, now 15, walked through the bustling streets of Kuo, his black kimono draped over his shoulders. His katana, still wrapped in black bandages, rested securely behind his back. To most, he was just an odd-looking teenager, but to those with keen senses, there was something different about him, something sharp, like a blade hidden in plain sight. He had spent years training in the wilderness, honing his skills, sharpening his instincts. But now, standing among the crowds, he felt like a stranger in a world he had long abandoned. And yet, he had no choice but to return. His stomach growled. "TCH figures," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. He had spent so much time training that he had forgotten about the basic needs of city life: food, shelter, money. His first priority was finding something to eat. He strolled through the marketplace, scanning the stalls filled with fresh produce and sizzling street food. The scent of grilled meat made his mouth water. He had lived off fish, wild berries, and whatever he could hunt for so long that even the idea of a warm meal felt foreign. His hand reached into his kimono pocket. Empty. Of course, he had no money. "Guess I didn't plan this part out," he sighed. As he pondered his next move, his instincts flared. Someone was watching him. His grip on his katana tightened ever so slightly as he walked forward. He had felt this kind of presence before. It wasn't human. Then he heard it. "He doesn't seem like an ordinary human." A voice whispered from the shadows of an alleyway. Another voice responded, softer but amused. "No sacred gear, no aura of a devil, yet he carries himself like a warrior. Interesting." Issei's steps slowed. Devils. He had heard about them before. He knew they lurked in places like this, hiding among humans, playing their games in the shadows. He had always stayed away from them. He had no interest in their kind. But if they had taken an interest in him, then ignoring them was no longer an option. With a casual movement, Issei stopped at a food stall and pointed at a skewer of grilled meat. "Oi, old man," he called out to the vendor. "I don't have money, but I can work for it." The vendor, a gruff man with a bushy beard, looked him up and down. "Huh, you don't look like you belong here, kid." "Yeah, I get that a lot." Issei smirked. "So, deal or no deal?" The vendor scratched his chin before tossing him the skewer. "You remind me of some punk I knew years ago. Consider it a freebie." Issei caught the skewer with ease. "Appreciate it." He took a bite. The rich, smoky flavor hit his tongue, and for a moment, he forgot about the devils lurking nearby. But that moment didn't last. The air shifted. From the corner of his eye, he saw them. two figures approaching him from the alleyway. Issei let out a slow breath, finishing his skewer before tossing the stick aside. "All right," he muttered. "Let's see what these bastards want." He turned to face them, his expression calm but unreadable. A swordsman stands alone. The two figures stepped out from the alley, their crimson eyes glowing faintly in the dim city lights. Their presence alone told Issei everything he needed to know, devils. He had spent years avoiding their kind, training in isolation, hoping to live outside the grasp of the supernatural world. Yet, here they were, drawn to him like moths to a flame. He sighed, shifting his stance ever so slightly. His katana remained secured behind his back, still wrapped in black bandages, but his aura carried the weight of a seasoned warrior. The taller devil, a man with slick-back silver hair, smirked. "You don't seem surprised to see us." Issei remained silent, his expression unreadable. The second devil, a woman with dark purple hair and sharp features, narrowed her eyes. "We've been watching you, boy. A human walking through Kuo with no fear, no sacred gear, and yet you carry yourself like a warrior." Issei let out a slow breath. "If you have something to say, say it. Otherwise, get out of my way." The silver-haired devil chuckled. "You've got some nerve, kid. Most humans would be trembling in fear." Issei met his gaze, unimpressed. "I'm not most humans." The air grew tense. The devils could sense it, the sheer sharpness in his presence. He wasn't bluffing. The woman's eyes flickered toward his back. "That sword. I wonder, can it cut through devils?" Issei's lips curled into a faint smirk. "Want to find out?" The silver-haired devil let out a low laugh. "Relax, we're not here to pick a fight yet." Issei remained silent, watching them carefully. The devil continued, his smirk never fading. "We're only here to deliver a message. You're being watched, swordsman. The supernatural world has taken notice of you." Issei's fingers twitched slightly. He had expected this much. The moment he entered the city, he knew he would no longer be invisible. The female devil added, "You walk a dangerous path, human. No affiliation, no allies. If you continue like this, it's only a matter of time before something bigger finds you." Issei narrowed his eyes. "Is that a warning or a threat?" The silver-haired devil smirked. "Neither. Just a fact." With that, the two turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Issei alone once more. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. "So, they're finally paying attention to me, huh?" he muttered. This changed things. He had trained all these years to wield his blade, to forge himself into something stronger. But now, the world of devils, angels, and fallen had taken an interest in him. There was no turning back. With a final glance toward the alley, Issei turned and walked away. The path ahead was unknown, but one thing was clear. If the supernatural world wanted to test him, they would soon learn. He was ready. A swordsman's work. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden hue over Kuo. The city was already alive with movement, but Issei found himself staring at something far less exciting. A job board. "TCH never thought I'd need one of these," he muttered. After spending years in isolation, training his body and blade, Issei had never considered what came after. He had survived on instincts, but instincts wouldn't put food on his plate in a city like this. His sharp eyes scanned the postings. Convenience store clerk? No. Fast food? Hell no. Janitor? He shook his head. Then something caught his eye. Security needed. Night shifts. No experience required. Must be physically capable. A smirk crept onto his face. Sounds perfect. The job. The building wasn't fancy. A small security agency tucked between a laundromat and a bar. The kind of place most people walked past without a second thought. Inside, an old man sat behind a desk, sipping black coffee. His name tag read Hideo. He had the look of someone who had seen too much, wrinkled skin, sharp eyes, and a permanent scowl. "You want a job?" Hideo asked, barely looking up. "Yeah," Issei replied. "I saw the posting." The old man finally glanced at him, taking in the kimono, the wrapped-up sword on his back, and the way Issei carried himself. "You some kind of cosplayer?" Issei smirked. Something like that. Hideo let out a low grunt. You ever done security work before? No. Ever been in a fight? Yes. Hideo's eyes narrowed. He took a slow sip of his coffee. Humph. You look like trouble. Issei shrugged. I just need a job. The old man stared at him for a moment longer before tossing a uniform onto the desk. Night shift. You watch the cameras, patrol the area, and if some drunk bastard tries to break in, you kick his ass, within reason. Issei picked up the uniform. Sounds easy. Don't get cocky, kid. Hideo leaned forward, lowering his voice. This city, it ain't normal. You see some weird shit at night. You keep your head down. You understand. Issei raised an eyebrow. Weird shit. He wasn't sure if the old man knew about the supernatural or if he was just paranoid, but either way, Issei wasn't the type to keep his head down. Still, he nodded. Got it. Hideo grunted in approval. Show up at 8 p.m. sharp. Don't be late. First night on the job. When the clock struck 8, Issei stood outside the building, now dressed in the black uniform. His katana remained strapped to his back, hidden beneath a long coat. The security room was small, filled with a wall of monitors showing different parts of the neighborhood. The job seemed simple enough. Watch the screens, patrol every hour, deal with any trouble. But something felt off. As he settled into his shift, his instincts flared. A presence. Faint but familiar. Somebody, or something, was nearby watching him. Issei leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. Looks like tonight won't be boring after all. The watchful eyes of the night. The night was quiet, too quiet. Issei leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the multiple screens in front of him. The job seemed simple enough, yet his instincts wouldn't let him relax. Something was out there, watching. His patrol was coming up. With a slow exhale, he pushed himself up and grabbed his coat, making sure his katana remained secured on his back beneath the fabric. As he stepped outside, the cold night air greeted him. The streets were mostly empty, the occasional distant headlights cutting through the darkness. Everything seemed normal, but he wasn't fooled. His instincts never lied. A shadow in the dark. Issei walked along the perimeter of the building, his sharp eyes scanning every alley and corner. The further he walked, the stronger the presence became. Then movement. A shadow flickered at the edge of his vision. He stopped. Slowly, his hand drifted toward the hilt of his sword, still wrapped in black bandages. The shadow moved again, faster this time. A whisper of air. A disturbance in the stillness. Then, a figure lunged from the darkness. Issei pivoted, stepping back as something sharp sliced through the air where his head had been. His eyes locked onto the attacker. A man. No. His eyes glowed an unnatural crimson, his skin slightly paler than it should be. A vampire. The creature grinned, revealing sharp fangs. You're quick, human. Issei exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his katana. You picked the wrong guy to mess with. The vampire chuckled. No. I picked the right one. Without warning, it lunged again, its speed unnatural. But this time, Issei was ready. In a single motion, he unsheathed his katana. The sound of steel slicing through the night was sharp and final. The vampire barely had time to react before Issei's blade slashed across its chest, sending it skidding backward. It let out a pained growl, clutching the wound. TCH, damn swordsman. Issei flicked his wrist, clearing the blade of blood. Had enough. The vampire hissed, but took a step back. Then another. It knew. One more strike, and it was dead. Damn it, this wasn't supposed to happen. The creature cursed under its breath before vanishing into the shadows, retreating. Issei didn't chase. Not yet. Instead, he sighed and resheathed his katana. Guess this job's gonna be more interesting than I thought. The fangs of the night. The moment the vampire vanished, Issei stayed still, listening. The streets had gone eerily silent again, as if the city itself was holding its breath. His fingers rested on the hilt of his sword. The wound he inflicted wasn't deep enough to kill. That vampire would be back. TCH. He adjusted his coat, making sure the katana remained concealed, and walked back inside the security office. The cameras still showed empty streets, as if nothing had happened. But Issei knew better. He sank into his chair, watching the screens, his mind replaying the fight. The vampire knew who he was. That was the strange part. Why would a vampire go out of its way to attack a lone swordsman? Issei's instincts screamed at him. Something bigger was coming. Morning after the hunt, the shift ended without further incident, and as the sun began to rise, Issei left the security building, stuffing his hands in his pockets as he walked. His job didn't pay much, but it was enough to keep him going. Stopping at a small food stall, he bought some rice balls, eating as he wandered the streets. I need more information. The supernatural world wasn't new to him. He had seen glimpses before, things most humans would never believe. But now, it was coming straight for him, and he had no intention of running. His feet carried him toward Kuo Academy. First day at Kuo Academy. The academy loomed before him, towering gates and pristine buildings. A new place, new faces. He had enrolled under the radar, keeping his past quiet. To the world, he was just another transfer student. His black kimono swayed slightly as he walked through the gates, his katana still wrapped and secured on his back beneath his coat. Students passing by sent him strange looks, whispering about his traditional clothing and mysterious presence. Is that a new transfer student? He looks kinda scary. Why is he wearing that? Issei ignored them. He wasn't here to make friends. Inside, he was directed to the faculty office, where a middle-aged teacher glanced at him over his glasses. Issei Hayadu, correct? That's me. The teacher sighed, rubbing his temple. Your file is unusual, but as long as you follow the rules, there won't be a problem. Your class is 2B. Don't cause trouble. Issei nodded, taking the slip of paper handed to him before heading toward his classroom. As he walked, he could feel it again. That presence. Familiar. Lurking. His eyes flicked toward the upper floors, where a certain red-haired girl stood by a window, watching him with deep curiosity. So, the devils have noticed me too. Class begins. Stepping into 2B, the classroom went silent for a moment. All eyes were on him. The teacher coughed. We have a new transfer student. Introduce yourself. Issei glanced at the class before sighing. Issei Hayadu. A moment of awkward silence. That's it. That's it. The teacher frowned but gestured toward an open seat. Fine. Just take a seat in. Before he could finish, the door slammed open. A loud, energetic voice filled the room. Wah! I'm late. A girl with black hair tied into a ponytail stumbled in, panting. She straightened, then noticed Issei standing there. Her brown eyes blinked. Huh, who's the new guy? Issei Hayadu. Oh, I'm Keitei's. Nice to meet ya. The trouble magnet begins. The energy in the classroom shifted after Keitei's dramatic entrance. Some students snickered, others rolled their eyes, and the teacher just sighed in exhaustion. Keitei's, take your seat. Yes, sir, she chirped before skipping toward her spot. Issei, still standing at the front, shook his head slightly. Loud one, huh? The teacher gestured toward an empty desk near the window. Hayadu, sit there. With a nod, Issei walked over and settled into his seat. He felt eyes on him. Whispers spread across the classroom. Why is he dressed like that? He looks like some kind of samurai. Do you think he's dangerous? Issei ignored it all, resting his chin on his hand as class finally began. Lunch break chaos. When the lunch bell rang, Issei planned to eat alone. He reached into his bag, pulling out a simple bento he had made earlier. Rice, grilled fish, and some vegetables. He had just started eating when, bam, a tray slammed onto his desk, nearly knocking his food over. Yo, transfer student. Issei blinked, looking up. A tall, muscular student with spiky hair and a cocky grin stood before him, arms crossed. Behind him, a few lackeys chuckled. Here we go. The spiky-haired guy leaned down. Heard you don't talk much. What's up with that? Issei stared at him for a moment before picking up his chopsticks again. I'm eating. A few students nearby gasped. Some held back laughter. The spiky-haired guy twitched. You. Dude, are you seriously messing with him? A familiar voice cut in. Kates. She popped up beside Issei's desk, arms crossed. You're seriously picking on the new guy. Real original hero. The guy, Hero, grunted. I ain't picking on him. I'm just curious, that's all. Issei continued eating. Kate smirked. Sure you are. What's next? You gonna challenge him to a duel or something? Hero blinked, then grinned. That's not a bad idea. Issei sighed. After school, the duel challenge. All right, new guy. Hero stood in the empty courtyard behind the school, cracking his knuckles. We're gonna settle this with a fight. A small crowd had gathered, including Kates and a few other students. Issei adjusted the katana on his back, but didn't move. Why? Because you look like some kind of warrior. I want to see what you got. Issei sighed again. I don't fight without a reason. Hero smirked. Then how about this? If I win, you gotta call me boss for a whole week. And if I win? Hero shrugged. Dunno. What do you want? Issei thought for a moment. Then, I want you to leave me alone. The crowd burst into laughter. Oh, cold. Hero just grinned. All right, deal. Now let's. What's going on here? A new voice interrupted. Everyone turned. Standing there, arms crossed, was Sauna Shirtorai, the student council president. Her sharp eye scanned the scene, locking onto Issei. I see the new student is already attracting trouble. The crowd fell silent. Hero coughed. This ain't what it looks like, Prez. Sauna adjusted her glasses. It looks like a fight, which is against school rules. Hero raised his hands. No fight. No fight. Just a friendly challenge, right, new guy? Issei exhaled. Sure. Sauna stared at him for a moment before nodding. Good. Because if there's trouble on your first day, Hayadu, I will personally deal with it. Then, without another word, she walked away. The moment she was gone, Hero groaned. Man, she's scary. Kates giggled. She totally just saved you from getting embarrassed. Issei stood up, slinging his bag over his shoulder. I'm leaving. Hero blinked. Oh, wait. We didn't even. But Issei was already gone. The crowd watched him disappear into the distance. Kate smirked. He's going to be interesting. The watchful eyes of Kuo. The next day, Issei arrived at Kuo Academy early. The morning air was crisp, and the school grounds were quieter than usual. He preferred it this way. Less noise, fewer distractions. His black kimono swayed slightly as he walked, his katana strapped tightly to his back with black bandages. Despite the peaceful atmosphere, he could feel something. A presence. Someone was watching him. He didn't react, but his grip on his bag tightened slightly. Morning classes, the unspoken challenge. As expected, whispers followed him again throughout the morning. His unusual attire and the katana on his back made him impossible to ignore. Did you hear? The new guy almost fought Hero yesterday. Yeah, but the student council stopped it. Bet he would have won. Or gotten his ass kicked. He ignored them all, focusing on his studies instead. Though he had never received a formal education, he had taught himself to read and understand complex subjects. His training required discipline, and that extended to learning as well. Still, one thing bothered him. From the corner of his eye, he noticed two specific individuals watching him. Sauna Shirtorai and Tsubaki Shinra, the student council president and her vice president. They weren't just observing him casually. They were studying him. Why? Issei didn't react, but he made a mental note. Something was off. Lunch break, an unexpected invitation. When the lunch bell rang, Issei went to his usual quiet spot on the school rooftop. Or at least, he tried to. Before he could reach the stairs, a voice stopped him. Hayadu-kun. He turned. Standing in front of him was Sauna Shirtorai, adjusting her glasses. Behind her, Tsubaki Shinra stood with her usual composed expression. Issei looked between the two of them. Something you need? Sauna nodded. Come with us. The student council would like to speak with you. He raised an eyebrow. Am I in trouble? No, she said simply. We just have some questions. Issei thought for a moment before sighing. Fine. Student council room, the test begins. The student council room was neat and orderly, just like its president. The other council members were absent, leaving only Sauna, Tsubaki, and Issei. Sauna gestured for him to sit, and he did, keeping his posture relaxed but alert. She leaned forward slightly. "You're an interesting person, Hayade-kun. I get that a lot." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You carry a katana with you at all times, you dress like a samurai, and you nearly got into a fight on your first day. That's not exactly normal." Issei shrugged. "I don't care about being normal." Tsubaki crossed her arms. "Then answer this. Why do you carry that sword?" Silence. Issei glanced at them both before closing his eyes briefly. Then he spoke. "It's a part of me." Sauna studied him carefully. "Is it real?" His gaze locked onto hers. "Do you want to find out?" For a brief moment, tension filled the room. Then, Sauna smirked. "No need. I already know." Issei's eyes narrowed slightly. What does she mean by that? Before he could ask, she continued. "You're different from the other students. But as long as you follow the school rules, we won't have a problem." "Right." Sauna leaned back, seemingly satisfied. "That's all for now. You're dismissed." Issei stood, but before leaving, he glanced at her one last time. Something about her felt unnatural, just like the presence he had felt earlier. As he walked out, one thought crossed his mind. This school is hiding something, and now he was in the middle of it. Silent observations and hidden agendas. Sauna's POV, calculating the samurai. Sauna Shirtorai sat in her office chair, adjusting her glasses as she watched Issei hire to leave the student council room. Her fingers tapped lightly against the polished wooden desk. "What do you think?" she asked without looking up. Tsubaki, standing beside her, let a quiet sigh. "He's an enigma. Not a single drop of magic in his body, and yet he feels dangerous." Sauna nodded. That was exactly what had been bothering her. She had met many humans before, ordinary ones, supernatural ones, even some with latent abilities they themselves weren't aware of. But Issei Hayadu, he was something else. A complete anomaly. No sacred gear. No magic. No aura of any supernatural origin. And yet, he felt like a warrior. Even the way he carried himself was different. Every movement was precise, as if trained to react to an attack at any given moment. His grip, his stance, his eyes. Everything about him screamed swordsman. Tsubaki broke the silence. "You noticed it too, didn't you?" Sauna nodded. "The way he responded to my question about the sword. It's a part of me." Sauna's eyes narrowed. That was not the response of someone who carries a weapon for show. Tsubaki crossed her arms. "Should we keep watching him?" A small smirk played on Sauna's lips. "We already are." This was getting interesting. And Sauna Shirtorai loved puzzles. Issei's POV, the unshaken blade. After leaving the student council room, Issei walked through the halls of Kuo Academy, his black kimono trailing behind him. His mind replayed the conversation with Sauna. She was testing me. Not openly, not aggressively, but subtly. She wanted to gauge his reaction, to see if he was lying. She knows something. But more importantly, she suspects something. It didn't matter. He had no reason to hide who he was. That said, he needed to be careful. Even though he had no magic or sacred gear, he wasn't stupid. This world was filled with beings beyond human comprehension. Devils, angels, fallen, and who knows what else. And he was just a man with a sword. A sword that had cut down every challenge life had thrown his way. Still, something about Sauna bothered him. Her eyes. They weren't the eyes of a normal student. They carried knowledge, calculation, and a quiet authority. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. TCH. He wasn't interested in whatever game she was playing. Right now he had one goal. To sharpen his blade. To perfect his swordsmanship. That was all that mattered. Later that night, the silent training. Under the pale glow of the moon, Issei stood alone in a secluded forest clearing outside the city. His black kimono billowed slightly in the evening breeze. In front of him, an old tree stood tall and unmoving. With slow, deliberate movements, he unwrapped the black bandages around his katana, revealing the pristine blade underneath. He took his stance. Then, slice. Faster than the eye could follow. His blade cut through the air. The old tree remained standing, For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a single leaf fell from the highest branch. Issei watched it descend, his grip on the hilt steady. The leaf landed softly on the ground, split perfectly in two. Issei exhaled. Not good enough. He adjusted his stance. Then he continued. Slash after slash. Strike after strike. No magic. No enhancements. No divine blessings. Just him. Just the sword. And that was all he needed. The encounter with the unseen. Issei's POV, the echo of the blade. The next day, Issei found himself at the park again, but this time, his mind was far from the peaceful surroundings. He had spent the entire night practicing his swordsmanship under the moon, and now his body was aching, sore from hours of relentless training. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was getting closer. He could feel it. Closer to mastering his blade. Closer to understanding the full potential of the katana he had inherited. As he walked through the park, he passed by groups of students, some chatting loudly, others laughing as they enjoyed their afternoon. He didn't pay much attention to them. He never did. What he did notice was the woman standing near the fountain, looking out over the water. She had a presence that was impossible to ignore. Her long, black hair cascaded down her back, and her red eyes gleamed with an intensity that struck him. Even without a word, she gave off an aura of authority. Is she another supernatural? He stopped a few meters away, his hand instinctively brushing against the hilt of his katana, the coolness of the blade offering him some comfort. The woman turned her head slowly toward him. There was no hostility in her gaze, but there was an undeniable curiosity. You're the one they call Issei Hayadu, aren't you? Her voice was calm, soft even, but there was an edge to it, a hidden strength. Issei narrowed his eyes. I don't know who you are, but I'm not interested in talking, he replied, his tone flat. He wasn't one to engage with strangers, especially when they gave off the vibe of someone who knew more than they should. She smiled, slightly, but enough for Issei to notice. I didn't think you would be, but you've been making quite an impression around here lately. Issei's fingers tightened around his katana's hilt. He knew the tone of her words wasn't casual. This woman was far from ordinary. Who are you? He asked, his voice now a little more serious. The woman took a step toward him, her gaze never leaving his. The name's Rias Gremory, she said smoothly. I've been observing you. Issei's heart skipped a beat. The Gremory name was not one he was unfamiliar with. He had heard whispers of the Gremory family in passing, rumors that they were an ancient, powerful clan. I'm not interested in your clan's politics, he said bluntly, his patience wearing thin. Rias chuckled, her eyes sparkling with amusement. Good, she said, because this isn't about politics. Issei narrowed his eyes. Then what is it about? She stepped closer, now just a few feet away. Her presence seemed to make the air around them hum with energy. It's about you, Issei Hayadu, she said softly. About your potential, your hidden power. Issei stiffened at the words, his hand instinctively going to the katana on his back, the blade still wrapped in its black bandages. What do you know about me? Rias raised a hand in a gesture of peace. Nothing yet, but I intend to find out. Rias POV, the samurai's heart. Rias Gremory watched Issei carefully as he stood there, his expression guarded. She could see the caution in his eyes, the wariness. He wasn't someone who trusted easily, and that made him dangerous. But it also made him fascinating. Tell me something, Issei, Rias began, her voice gentle but probing. Do you know what the world is truly like? Issei blinked, clearly taken aback by the question. What are you talking about? He asked, his tone laced with confusion. Rias smiled faintly. The world you see with your eyes, the one where everything seems simple, where you live in peace. None of that is real. There's a deeper world, a world of the supernatural, a world filled with beings far more dangerous than you could imagine. Issei stood still, his expression unreadable. I know more than you think, he replied, his voice low and cold. Rias raised an eyebrow. Is that so? You're not just any ordinary human, are you? His grip tightened around the hilt of his katana, the silence between them thick with tension. I'm not here to play games, Issei finally said, and I'm not interested in your supernatural world. Ria's smile widened slightly. I see, she said softly. Then we'll see how long that lasts, won't we? Without another word, she turned to leave, her red eyes glinting with something like amusement, and something far more dangerous. Issei's POV, the unknown path. As Rias walked away, Issei felt a knot tighten in his chest. He wasn't sure what it was about her, but there was something off. Something about the way she spoke, the way she looked at him. It wasn't just the power she radiated. No, it was something deeper. Something that made him question everything he thought he knew. He gripped his katana tighter, his thoughts a whirl of confusion. What does she know? What does she want from me? Issei turned away and walked back toward his apartment. He had no answers to those questions. But one thing was certain. His quiet life was about to change forever. Shadows of the past and uncertain futures. Issei's POV, a restless night. Issei sat in his dimly lit apartment, the soft glow of the moon filtering through the window. His katana rested beside him, the black bandages tightly wrapped around its sheath. He had barely touched his dinner. His mind was too preoccupied. Rias Gremory. He didn't know why, but something about that woman unsettled him. It wasn't just her confidence or the way she spoke like she already knew something about him. No, it was the fact that she had approached him at all. How does she know my name? He wasn't famous. He had spent most of his life living in isolation, training, working odd jobs to get by. He had no real connections, no friends, no reason for someone like her to take an interest in him. And yet, she had looked at him like he was part of her world, a world he had no intention of entering. Issei exhaled, running a hand through his messy brown hair. He should forget about it. He had more important things to focus on. His training wasn't complete. He wasn't strong enough yet. Not for what was coming. Because something was coming. He could feel it. Sauna's POV, a curious observation. Sauna Citri sat in the student council office, adjusting her glasses as she read through a report on her desk. But her mind wasn't fully on her work. She was still thinking about him. Issei Hayadu, a student with no remarkable academic history, no known ties to any supernatural factions, and yet there was something about him. She had sensed it ever since he enrolled at Koho Academy. It wasn't just the way he carried himself, calm, unreadable, different from the usual students. It was the way he felt, like a blade hidden in plain sight. Sauna, you're distracted. Tsubaki spoke, her voice calm yet knowing. Sauna glanced up at her vice president, then sighed. I've been observing a student, she admitted. Issei Hayadu. Tsubaki raised an eyebrow. The one who carries a katana? Sauna nodded. Yes, he's different, and Rias seems to have taken an interest in him as well. Tsubaki folded her arms. That doesn't surprise me. He stands out. A swordsman in a school like this? It's unusual. Exactly, Sauna murmured, and that's what bothers me. She leaned back in her chair, deep in thought. What was Issei's true nature? And why did she feel like he was walking a path far more dangerous than anyone realized? Issei's POV, a sudden challenge. The next morning, Issei made his way to school as usual, his katana secured behind his back with its black bandages. He could feel the eyes of students on him, as always. Whispers followed him, but he ignored them. He had gotten used to it. But something felt off today. As he walked through the courtyard, he felt a presence, a sharp, focused energy aimed directly at him. He stopped. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw him. A tall student with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, dressed in a school uniform. Kiba Yudo, the so-called Prince of Koho Academy. But Issei didn't care about that. What mattered was the way Kiba was looking at him, like he was a swordsman sizing up another. Issei Hayadu, Kiba greeted, his voice smooth and polite. You're quite the interesting student. Issei narrowed his eyes. Did you need something? Kiba smiled. I was curious. You carry a katana, but I've never seen you draw it. Are you a swordsman? Issei didn't answer right away. He could already tell where this was going. What if I am? Kiba's expression didn't change, but there was a spark in his eyes. Then, would you humor me with a spar? The request didn't surprise Issei. He could feel it. The way Kiba moved, the way he carried himself. This guy wasn't an ordinary student. But neither was he. Issei exhaled through his nose. Not interested. Kiba blinked, seemingly caught off guard. Why not? Because I don't draw my blade for fun. There was a moment of silence between them. Then Kiba chuckled softly. I see. You're disciplined, he said, nodding. That's respectable. Issei didn't respond. He simply walked past Kiba, uninterested in continuing the conversation. But even as he left, he could feel Kiba watching him. And he knew. This wasn't the last time they would cross paths. Unraveling the threads of fate. Issei's POV, a cold morning. The days felt like they were blurring together. Issei had gotten used to the routine of school, his part-time job, and his training. His mind had settled into a quiet rhythm, like the calm before a storm. But deep down, he knew something was coming. He could feel the tension in the air, like static building up before a lightning strike. His katana, always within arm's reach, was a constant reminder of the power that he carried with him. It had become more than just a weapon. It was a part of him, a symbol of his resolve, his training, his past. He sat on the roof of Kuo Academy, watching the students below as they moved between classes. It was a rare moment of peace, one he welcomed. I wonder how long I can keep this up. His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. Issei Hayadu. He turned to see Rias Grimmery standing at the edge of the roof, her crimson hair flowing like a wave of fire. She was alone this time. Issei didn't flinch. He didn't care for her sudden appearances. Still, he remained quiet, waiting for her to speak. I've been meaning to talk to you again. Rias began, her voice softer than usual. Issei raised an eyebrow but said nothing. You've been avoiding me, she said, stepping closer. Why? Because I don't have time to waste on people who don't matter, he replied, his voice cool and detached. Rias stopped, her expression unreadable. You think I don't matter? Issei met her gaze, his eyes sharp. No, I just don't want to be part of whatever game you're playing. Rias' lips curled into a small smile, but there was no warmth in it. You're more interesting than I thought. Before he could respond, a new voice interrupted them. Rias, there you are. Both Issei and Rias turned to see Kiba approaching them, his usual calm demeanor hiding the intensity in his gaze. Rias smiled at him, but her eyes flickered back to Issei, a hint of curiosity lingering. Kiba, she greeted him warmly, then turned back to Issei. We'll talk later. Without another word, she walked past him, her heels clicking against the rooftop as she left. Kiba watched her leave before looking at Issei. You're a tough one, aren't you? Kiba said with a slight chuckle. I'm just not interested, Issei replied, turning his gaze back to the city below. Kiba didn't seem offended. You know, you might be the first person to turn Rias down like that. Most people are either too scared or too curious to walk away. Issei didn't answer. He didn't care about the dynamics of the supernatural world, especially when it came to people like Rias and Kiba. He had his own goals, and they didn't involve getting tangled in their games. But that didn't mean he wasn't aware of the eyes that were constantly on him. Sauna's POV, watching from the shadows. From her position in the student council office, Sauna couldn't help but observe. She'd seen Rias and Kiba interact with Issei, and she couldn't deny that the boy intrigued her. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the desk as she thought about him. He's different from the others, she thought, narrowing her eyes. He doesn't seem to care about the politics, the games, the alliances. But that katana of his that tells a story. Tsubaki stood beside her, quietly watching her thoughts unfold. You've been thinking about him a lot lately. Sauna sighed. There's something about him. I don't think he's just a regular student, but I can't figure him out. He's too elusive. Maybe he's not meant to be figured out, Tsubaki suggested. Sauna looked at her vice president, raising an eyebrow. What do you mean? Tsubaki smiled, her eyes gleaming with a quiet understanding. Not everything in this world needs to be understood. Sometimes, the most dangerous individuals are the ones you can't read. Sauna couldn't argue with that. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how true it was. Issei was a puzzle, and she had no idea how deep it went. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't the only one watching him. Issei's POV, the job that waits. Later that evening, after school had ended, Issei made his way to his part-time job. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, something that gave him a sense of purpose. He worked at a small, family-owned restaurant on the edge of the city. The owner was kind but had little patience for those who didn't work hard. Issei liked it that way. The clatter of plates and the murmur of customers filled the air as he stepped into the restaurant. The smell of fresh food greeted him, and he felt a sense of relief. "Ah, Issei, you're here," the owner called out from behind the counter. Issei nodded, moving quickly to his station. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different tonight. He couldn't explain it, but the air felt charged, like the calm before a storm. As he went about his tasks, he glanced up to see a group of men entering the restaurant. They were dressed in suits, looking out of place in the humble establishment. Issei didn't pay them much mind, but the moment one of them met his gaze, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. It was brief, but enough for him to know that something had shifted. He quickly returned to his work, but the unease lingered in the back of his mind. The unseen threat. The following day felt oddly tense. The air seemed to thicken with a sense of foreboding, and Issei couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He had been going through his usual routine, attending classes, working at the restaurant, and continuing his training in secret. But today felt different. As Issei walked through the school grounds, his hand instinctively brushed against the katana hidden behind his back. The weight of it was a comfort, a constant reminder of his strength. But the more he walked, the more he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. He glanced over his shoulder, eyes scanning the crowds of students. Nothing seemed out of place, yet a sense of unease gnawed at him. It was as if someone, or something, was watching him. "Issei, hey." The voice broke his train of thought. He turned to see Kiba jogging toward him, looking unusually serious. "What's up?" Issei asked, his tone flat. Kiba stopped in front of him, his blue eyes flickering with something akin to concern. "I've been meaning to ask you something." Issei raised an eyebrow. "What?" Kiba hesitated, glancing around as if making sure no one was listening. "I've been noticing something strange. There are people, powerful people, who are interested in you, more than just Rias and the others, and they've been looking for you." Issei's heart skipped a beat. "Who are they?" Kiba's expression grew darker. "I'm not entirely sure, but I've heard whispers. They know about your katana. They know about your power." Issei narrowed his eyes, his grip tightening around the strap of his bag. "What do you mean, they know?" "I'm talking about a group of individuals, dangerous people," Kiba explained quietly. "They've been searching for someone with your abilities, and they might not be as friendly as Rias and the others." Issei could feel a shiver run down his spine. The last thing he needed was more attention from dangerous people. His mind raced. "What do they want with me?" Before he could respond, a figure approached from the distance, someone Issei recognized immediately. It was Rias. She walked toward him with her usual grace, but there was something different in her eyes. Something serious. "Issei," Rias said softly, her voice carrying an edge of urgency. "We need to talk." Issei crossed his arms. "About what?" Rias glanced at Kiba, then back at Issei, her expression tight. "There are things happening that you're not aware of. We've kept our distance from you for a reason, but now we need you to listen. There are enemies coming for you. And not just any enemies." Issei's grip on the katana tightened. "Why should I care about that? You've already tried to involve me in your games once." "I know," Rias admitted, her gaze softening slightly. "But this isn't about games. There are things that are far more dangerous than the politics of our world, and you're in the middle of it. Whether you like it or not, you're part of something much bigger." Issei stared at her, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He had always known that he wasn't just some ordinary human, but this was different. "You'll need to trust us," Kiba added, his voice quiet but firm. "There's a dark force moving, and it's coming straight for you." The words echoed in his mind, and for the first time in a while, Issei felt fear, not for his life, but for the uncertainty that surrounded him. He wasn't just some student anymore. He was a target, and there was no running from it. Sauna's POV. watching from the shadows. Sana sat in her office, the light from the setting sun casting a golden glow through the windows. She had been keeping an eye on Issei for days, and the more she observed him, the more she realized just how much he was hiding. It wasn't just his katana or his combat skills. There was something more to him, something dangerous. Tsubaki, keep an eye on him, Sana thought, tapping her fingers on her desk. Tsubaki, standing nearby, nodded. You think he'll get involved? Sana's eyes flickered over to the window, where the last rays of sunlight kissed the horizon. He already is. Whether he knows it or not, the game is already in motion, and Issei Hayato has a role to play. Issei's POV, the awakening. That night, Issei found himself unable to sleep. The weight of Rias and Kiba's words lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on him, something he wasn't ready for. In the dead of night, Issei found himself walking through the quiet streets, the cool breeze brushing past him. He could feel the weight of the katana against his back, its presence like a constant reminder that he wasn't just a normal teenager. He stopped in an alleyway, his senses sharpening. There was a presence here, a strange, cold energy that seemed to crawl along his skin. He reached for the hilt of his sword, and then he saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, cloaked in darkness. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and they moved with an unsettling precision. Issei Hayato. One of them spoke, his voice low and gravely. We've been looking for you. Issei's grip tightened around the katana's hilt, his eyes narrowing. And what do you want with me? The figure stepped forward, his smirk barely visible in the dim light. We need you. Your power, your potential. You're just the beginning. The others around him shifted, like wolves circling their prey. Issei's heart began to race, but he didn't show it. He knew what he had to do. His fingers brushed against the blade of his katana, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his past, the training, the memories, come alive inside him. You want me? Issei said, his voice cold and steely. Then come and take me. The blood moon rising. Issei's POV clashed in the shadows. The air in the alley was thick with tension. The moonlight barely filtered through the buildings, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. Issei's grip on his katana tightened, his senses sharpened to a razor's edge. His body was ready to spring into action, but the figures in front of him were unlike anything he had faced before. Issei Hayato, the leader of the shadowed figure said again, his voice dripping with menace. You have something we want, and we're here to take it. Issei didn't respond at first. He was trying to gauge them, to figure out who or what they were. There was no question in his mind that they were dangerous. The energy radiating from them was dark, almost suffocating. But there was something else, something familiar, a kind of hunger that echoed deep in his chest. Whatever you think you're here for, you're wrong, Issei said, his voice cold. His free hand moved to adjust the black kimono that draped over his frame, his eyes never leaving the shadows. One of the figures stepped forward, pulling back their hood to reveal a face that was pale and gaunt, with eyes that glowed a sickly yellow. You're a fool, Issei. You don't even know what you're dealing with. Before Issei could respond, the figure lunged at him with lightning speed, claws slashing through the air. Issei's katana was already in motion before the attack even fully registered. The blade met the figure's claws with a sharp, metallic clash. Not bad, the leader said, a slow smile creeping across his face. But it's going to take more than that to stop us. Issei felt the force of the strike reverberate through his arms, but he didn't flinch. His body moved on instinct, stepping to the side to avoid a follow-up strike. The katana felt weightless in his hands, as though it were an extension of himself. The years of self-training were paying off. He spun, his katana slashing across the figure's chest, but it only left a shallow wound. The figure growled, his yellow eyes narrowing. This isn't over, the figure hissed, retreating into the shadows along with the rest of the group. Issei took a deep breath, wiping the sweat from his brow. He had fought his share of dangerous opponents before, but this was different. These weren't ordinary enemies. They were powerful, almost inhuman, and they were after him. You're getting faster, a voice said from behind him. Issei turned to see Kiba stepping out from the shadows, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a seriousness that made Issei's stomach drop. "You knew about this?" Issei asked, narrowing his eyes. Kiba gave a grim nod. "I wasn't sure who they were, but I sensed their presence. You're not the only one who's been a target, but I didn't expect them to come after you so soon." Issei sheathed his katana and looked at his friend, his mind racing. "Who are they? What do they want with me?" Kiba's expression darkened. "I don't know, but I have a feeling we're about to find out." Sauna's POV, the web tightens. Back at the student council room, Sauna leaned back in her chair, her eyes focused on the report in front of her. There had been a significant increase in activity from unknown factions in the area, and it all seemed to be centered around Issei. It wasn't just his abilities they were after, it was something else. "Something's going on," Sauna murmured, tapping her pen on the desk. Tsubaki, who had been observing quietly from the side, spoke up. "You think it's related to the katana? Or something else?" Sauna paused, her thoughts racing. The pieces were starting to come together, but it was still unclear what exactly they were facing. It could be. But we've underestimated him. He's not just a pawn in this game. He's a player. "I think we should tell Rias," Tsubaki suggested. "She might be able to help." Sauna shook her head. "No, Rias is already too involved in his life. We need to gather information first. If he's going to be the center of this storm, we need to be prepared." Issei's POV, a call to action. Issei stood in the middle of the dark street, his mind buzzing with questions. The encounter with the shadowy figures had only left him more confused. They weren't demons. They weren't angels. And they weren't fallen angels either. Who were they? "You need to get stronger." Kiba's voice interrupted his thoughts. Issei glanced over at him, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Kiba looked around, as if to make sure no one else was listening, and then stepped closer to Issei. "I've been training for years, and I'm still not at my peak. But there's something about you. You're different. You need to start taking this more seriously." Issei felt a flicker of annoyance. "What? You think I'm not taking it seriously?" Kiba shook his head. "No, I'm saying you need to trust in your strength. You're not just some guy with a katana. You've got the blood of warriors in you. You're more than that." Issei stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Kiba was right. He had been running from the truth for too long. His katana, the power in his blood, it was all part of him. It was time to embrace it. "I'll train harder," Issei said, determination hardening in his voice. "I won't let them take me down." Kiba smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit." Sauna's POV, the game begins. Back at the student council room, Sauna sat with her arms crossed, deep in thought. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the message. It was from Tsubaki. "We have a problem. Issei has become the focal point of something far bigger than we thought. We need to act fast." Sauna exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping the table. This is just the beginning. Issei's POV, the calm before the storm. That night, as Issei lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something huge was coming. The encounters with those strange figures, the cryptic warnings from Kiba, and the constant sense of being watched. It was all too much. But no matter what happened, Issei was determined to protect himself. He had to be ready. Tomorrow would bring more danger. He knew it, but he wasn't afraid. "This is my fight now," he thought, his eyes closing as he drifted into a restless sleep. Into the abyss. Issei's POV, the first real fight. The morning light barely filtered through the curtains, casting a muted glow across Issei's modest room. His thoughts were still heavy from the events of the night before. The figures who had attacked him, the strange energy they radiated, and the cryptic words they had spoken, it all gnawed at him. Like a puzzle he couldn't quite put together. He rose from his bed, tying his black kimono tighter, the familiar weight of his katana resting against his back beneath the bandages. His resolve was clear. He couldn't afford to keep doubting himself. Not anymore. They'll come again. I know it. But today, he wasn't going to just wait for them. Today, he was going to make a move. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon as he made his way into the city. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional passerby hurrying to their destinations. Issei kept his gaze forward, his mind set on the task ahead. He needed answers, and answers only came with power. Kiba's POV: unspoken truths. Kiba hadn't heard from Issei since their last encounter, and that made him uneasy. He had seen the way Issei handled himself, calm, collected, and sharp, but something was off. Kiba had been a part of the supernatural world long enough to recognize when someone was preparing for something much bigger than themselves. He's training harder than I expected. Kiba had his own suspicions about the mysterious attackers that had shown interest in Issei. They weren't like anything he had encountered before, and it bothered him. Not just because they had targeted Issei, but because Kiba wasn't sure if he could handle this threat on his own. I need to keep an eye on him. He decided to take a detour to track Issei down. Issei's POV: the first strike. The streets of the city were quiet, but the silence felt like an ominous prelude to something dangerous. Issei's hand hovered near his katana as he walked, his mind constantly running through scenarios in his head. He had made his decision. If the enemies wanted him, they could come and face him on his terms. He wasn't going to run anymore. He wasn't going to hide. The katana was his to wield, and he would do it with pride. As he passed an alleyway, something shifted in the air. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his instinct screamed. Without hesitation, he drew the katana from behind his back, the steel glinting in the morning light. A figure emerged from the shadows. "You're quicker than I thought," the figure said, their voice distorted and harsh. Issei's grip tightened. The figure was cloaked in black robes, their face obscured by a hood. "You've been following me," Issei stated, his voice calm but firm. The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Not following, observing. We've been watching you for a long time. The one with the katana. The one who doesn't belong." Issei's grip on the hilt tightened, his stance shifting into one of readiness. "What do you want from me?" The figure stepped forward, revealing pale, almost sickly skin and glowing yellow eyes. "We want what's ours, and you're going to give it to us." Without another word, the figure lunged, their claws slashing through the air with unnatural speed. Issei was faster. His katana moved with a precision born from years of training and instinct. He blocked the attack, the blade meeting the figure's claws with a loud, metallic clash. He could feel the power behind the attack, but it wasn't enough to break his guard. "Not bad," the figure hissed, stepping back. Issei didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, his katana cutting through the air in a wide arc. The figure barely managed to dodge, but the blade still left a deep cut across their arm. The figure snarled, a burst of dark energy emanating from their body as they charged again. Issei braced himself. Kiba's POV: the arrival. Kiba had followed the faint trail of energy emanating from Issei, his instincts telling him that his friend was in danger. He moved swiftly through the streets, his eyes scanning the area until he saw it, the clash between Issei and the mysterious figure. So this is what he's been preparing for. Without hesitation, Kiba rushed into the fray, drawing his sword as he closed the distance. As he reached Issei, he shouted, "Issei, watch out!" Issei turned just in time to see Kiba arrive. With no words exchanged, the two fell into sync, a bond forged by their shared experience. Kiba's sword danced through the air, slicing through the figure's dark energy and forcing them to step back. The figure growled, clearly more frustrated now. "So, the legendary sword master arrives. This will be interesting." Issei's grip on his katana tightened. "We're not backing down." Issei's POV: an unexpected revelation. The battle intensified, and Issei could feel his energy draining with each passing second. But there was something else, a strange pull, a voice in the back of his mind urging him to push harder, to tap into something deeper. As the figure attacked again, something inside Issei shifted. He could feel the power in his blood surge. His katana felt heavier, more alive in his hands. The blade crackled with an energy he couldn't explain, but it was as if the sword itself was calling to him. With a swift, precise strike, Issei slashed through the air. The figure's dark energy shattered, and the blade connected with their chest, sending them flying back into the shadows. For a moment, everything was still. But Issei knew this wasn't over. The battle had just begun. Sauna's POV, a step closer to the truth. Back at the student council room, Sauna sat, her mind racing. She had been keeping an eye on Issei's progress, and it seemed like he was pushing himself to the limit. But there was something more. The energy around him was changing, growing. This power, it's unlike anything I've seen before. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Tsubaki stepped inside, holding a report in her hand. There's been a disturbance in the city. Issei's been involved. Sauna's gaze hardened. I know. It's just a matter of time before they come for him again. Issei's POV, no turning back. Issei stood in the alley, breathing heavily as he wiped the sweat from his brow. Kiba had already checked the area, ensuring no one else was around. Who were they? Issei asked, his voice still sharp from the adrenaline of the fight. Kiba frowned. I don't know, but they're after something, and it has to do with you. Issei looked down at his katana, the weight of it heavy in his hand. I won't run from this anymore. Whatever it is, I'm going to face it head on. Kiba nodded, his eyes serious. You're not alone in this. We'll figure out together. But as the two of them walked away from the alley, Issei couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker was lurking on the horizon. And soon, the storm would break. If you enjoyed this, What If Issei was the reincarnation of Jubei Kibagami scenario? Make sure to hit the like button and share it with friends who might enjoy these kinds of what-if stories. This project took a lot of time and effort, but it was definitely worth it. Thank you so much for watching, and I appreciate your support.